My name is Dr. Matthew Hallet from the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida. I'm also a member of Tropical Conservation Development Program and the Jacksonville Zoo and Garden. So I'm very happy to be here this morning to tell everyone about a camera trap survey of the medium and large bodied mammals of the Barima-Mora Passage that we conducted about 2 years ago now. And we had some amazing and very surprising results. So for me, I've been working in Region 9 in Rupununi in Guyana for more than 12 years now. And probably over those 12 years have looked at, I don't know, millions of camera trap images. And over time, it's become hard to surprise me. But what we found in the Barima-Mora Passage did give me some pause. It was more and different from what I was expecting. So I'm happy to be here to share our results. We were fortunate enough to work with a very talented team of folks from the Barima-Mora Passage area, from Mabruma and the surrounding villages. And we were also accompanied by Mr. Fernando Lai from Region 9, originally from Upakari, now living in Letem, to support the team. Mr. Lai and I have been working together on research for much of the time that I've been working in Guyana, and so it was great to have a counterpart from the Rupununi to foster this exchange between Region 1 and Region 9. So I'll start out with a little bit of the background. So this was my first time in Region 1. Of course, I'm living and working in Florida now, so I'm familiar with the mangrove and coastal environment. But doing camera trap work in the mangroves was a whole different world for me, and why I said that the results were really surprising. So flying into Mabruma, looking at the Kaituma and Barima rivers, the field work seemed to be straightforward enough. It looked like it was just forest below, which our teams are accustomed to working in. Getting in the boats from Mabruma and going downriver was very familiar to us, similar to what we're doing in the Rupununi all the time. But once we turned off the main rivers, things seemed to get a lot different and a little bit more challenging. And as we weaved into smaller and smaller creeks, things proved to be much different than the Rupununi and presented their own unique challenges. And then when we got out of the boats, moving around in this landscape that's flooded every day by tides, has saltwater intrusion, has lots of roots and very thick, deep mud all around, provided some unique experiences and some unique challenges. And while walking around in the environment, I was curious as to what we would be seeing on these camera traps. We were seeing lots of tracks of small animals, especially agoutis, raccoons, and others. But I was curious about what these camera traps would be showing us about the mammals of the Barima-Mora Passage. It was very hard work. We spent about 10 days setting camera traps, moving from one place to another. Generally, we space our cameras around 2 kilometers apart. In the Rupununi, we're moving those 2 kilometers primarily on foot. However, in the Barima-Mora Passage, it was much more challenging because of the mud slogging through these areas. Walking multiple kilometers was hard. So fortunately, we had very experienced and skilled captains that were able to navigate our boats in and out of small creeks and get us fairly close to the areas that we wanted to access to set cameras. So in the end, we were able to get the job done and accomplish the goals that we set out to, which was setting 30 camera traps across the entirety of the Barima-Mora Passage area. The cameras were spaced 2 to 3 kilometers apart, primarily along the Barima and Kaituma rivers. These cameras were out in the field from February to May 2021 for a total of 3,018 trap nights, or that's just a fancy way of saying out for 3,018 days. And those 30 cameras produced 41,452 photos. So while the work tromping around in the mud and setting the cameras was hard, we also had our work cut out for us in sorting through all those photos and identifying all the species that were there. So of those 41,000 photos. 4,000 of those were independent records of animals. So the cameras are set to take sequences of 3 photos with each trigger, right? Every camera trap is motion censored. So anytime an animal passes by the front of the camera, it's triggered and takes a sequence of 3 photos, right? So you take that 41,452 and divide by 3, right? Those are the number of sequences. Sometimes an animal hangs around in front of the camera for an extended period of time. Sometimes even lays down in front of the camera and takes a nap, and you end up with 1,000 photos of the same animal just there sleeping away. So by the time we drilled down to how many independent photos of animals, we had over 4,000. As you can see below, this is just the sheer number of photographs. That the red-rumped agouti was by far the most common species on our cameras, followed by the common opossum, also known affectionately as the yauri, spiny rat, red-broched deer, lowland paca or laba, and white-lipped peccary. When we look at how the number of sites that each one of these species occupied, it probably gives you a better sense of how each species is distributed across the area. You see that we had a lot of species that were fairly common, and we had a lot of the species that you would typically associate with tropical rainforests were right there inhabiting the mangrove forest in the Barima-Mora Passage. So overall, we detected 64 species across our 30 camera traps, and this included 28 mammals, 36 birds, and 1 reptile. And of those 64 species, this includes 14 species of conservation concern. So I'm going to highlight some of the individual species and talk about them a little bit as we go here, but you can see the distribution of the community overall here on this graph. So we documented 5 of the 6 wildcat species that's found in Guyana in the Barima-Mora Passage. This includes, of course, Guyana's national animal, the jaguar. We documented jaguars at several different locations. They are known to be very tolerant of inundated landscapes. So while you don't typically associate jaguars with mangrove habitat, there are places throughout their range where they freely inhabit spaces that are regularly flooded by water, and they're capable swimmers who can take to the water and even hunt by water. Many people have probably seen those videos, those National Geographic videos of jaguars going into rivers and hunting caimans, but they also can go for capybaras and other aquatic species as needed. The puma is a species that's typically associated with drier habitats. They're not known to love water. And so we did document pumas in several of the more upland parts of the Barima-Mora Passage. And by upland, I mean like a couple feet upland, right? There's not dramatic elevation changes in this region, but there are some forests that are farther away from the rivers that we were able to access that stay dry most of the year. And it was here that we found pumas prowling around in the forests. Ocelots were the most common cat species in the Barima-Mora Passage, and probably the most common cat species all across Guyana. They're highly adaptable, can be found in swamp habitats, in open savanna, scrub, dry forest, up and down mountains, and everywhere in between. They're a very adaptable cat, and so we weren't surprised that they were the most common species in Barima-Mora Passage. And sorry, I forgot to mention that of the species you've seen so far, the jaguar is considered a near threatened species by the IUCN. But we also found the margay, who is also a near threatened species by the IUCN. It was interesting documenting the margay at several different locations here because they're a semi-arboreal cat who's also not known to be very water tolerant. But this just means that there are large trees big enough for climbing and hunting. They actually hunt in the treetops, arboreal rodents and opossums and other species. So shows that there's not just mangrove habitat in the Barima-Mora Passage, but this dynamic mix of habitats of flooded forests, flooded forests and mangroves, and then some mature tropical forest at the back. So there's a better look. We only got a few pictures of the margay. They're primarily nocturnal, so there's a better look at what they look like. Very similar to the ocelot, but the defining characteristics is that they have a very long tail. Their tail is about 3/4 of the length of their body, and that helps them to navigate up in the treetops. We also documented Guyana's smallest wild cat, which is the oncilla. This is another highly adaptable cat that actually prefers not primary rainforest habitat because they're so small. They're often outcompeted and even predated on by the other cats. Oncilla are very rare, so in all of the camera trap work that we've done across the Rupununi, we've only gotten a handful of pictures of oncilla, so it was very exciting to see this near threatened species in the mangrove forest in the Barima-Mora Passage. And there's another look at the oncilla. Not much bigger than a house cat. So they're very small wild cat. Again, this sort of spotted pattern, very similar to the ocelot and the margay as well. Moving on to other carnivores, a very exciting sighting in the Barima-Mora Passage were giant river otters. This is an endangered species according to the IUCN red list of threatened species, and they're considered the most endangered mammal in all of South America. So we know that from across Guyana in the Rupununi, they're fairly common. In other areas, they're sighted even along the coast. They're a fairly common sight. So seeing them in the Barima-Mora Passage wasn't a big surprise, but it's always great to know that that these species are around. And it was very interesting. They're not known to be very saltwater tolerant. So in these areas where you have brackish waters where salt and fresh water are mixing, it was very interesting to see them sort of here on the extreme end of the environmental conditions that they normally tolerate. And we did see them on multiple cameras, and we also spotted them from the boat as we were moving up and down to set the cameras themselves. So it was clear that giant river otters are using the Barima-Mora Passage area, and it forms a habitat that supports family groups like this. And you even see some little ones in the back there showing that this is a reproductive group as well. Another species from the weasel family is the greater grison. Grison are typically associated with savanna habitats and dry habitats. So this was another one of those species that took me by surprise seeing them show up on the cameras. Another species that was primarily found in the tropical forest at the back, not necessarily in the mangroves themselves, but again, another part of the mammal community in Guyana. There's a better look at the grison because they're the picture there is not the best. In the weasel family, looks somewhat like a badger, but a pretty voracious little carnivore. One of the more common mammals that we physically saw, observed tracks of in the Barima-Mora Passage is the crab-eating raccoon. Right, similar to North American raccoon species, but South America's own. They're highly associated with swampy and flooded habitats. They readily hunt all sorts of animals at the water edge, crabs, crayfish, frogs, anything that they can get their hands on, and they're well known for washing their food before they eat it. So when a raccoon finds something that they want to eat, they take it down to the water's edge and wash it off. So maybe one of the most the animal species that's most into cleanliness in the animal kingdom. So they're highly associated with water and swampy habitats. So this wasn't a big surprise, but they were very common in the Barima-Mora Passage. Another member of the weasel family is the tyra. There's a better look at the tyra there. Semi-arboreal weasel, typically associated with tropical forest, but pretty adaptable. We see them in the Rupununi savannas and in other sort of transitional habitats. So we documented them on multiple cameras in the Barima-Mora Passage. They can also, so they take on this color form that you're seeing here, but also can be sort of all blonde colored, which is fairly common in the Rupununi. So the picture on the top there, the color of that individual's head, you can have sort of all dark individuals like you see here in the camera trap photos, ones with a light head like you see in the photo above, and then ones with sort of an all over blonde color. And you can see those sort of all across Guyana. Moving away from the carnivores and into the large herbivores, the red brocket deer was the most common sort of large ungulate species, so large hoofed mammal. And we had a fair amount of photos of red brocket deer. According to the IUCN Red List, this is a species that's considered data deficient because there's just not enough information on them. So gathering information on species like this, particularly at the edges of their range in mangrove habitats, literally at the edge of South America, is critical data for informing how these species are managed moving forward. And the bush deer is also known as a game species that's readily consumed by communities surrounding the Barima-Mora Passage. So seeing them around fairly common was a good sign that for a healthy forest. White-lipped peccaries were fairly common in the Barima-Mora Passage as well. Another near-threatened species by the IUCN Red List that's also readily consumed by communities around the Barima-Mora Passage. We did pass through on every morning the market at Mabaruma, and bush deer and white-lipped peccary were, along with laba, were some of the more common game species that we saw in the wild meat market there. And then in talking to the folks that we were working with from the region, they noted that this guy, the white-lipped peccary, is probably the most commonly hunted and most commonly consumed species in the Barima-Mora Passage. And that's not uncommon from across the Amazon. White-lipped peccaries can live in massive herds of up to 200 individuals in a single herd, and they reproduce very, very quickly. They almost always have young, and so they're actually very resilient to hunting pressure in areas where they persist. They have had some over the years. There have been some questions, and there have been sort of these large-scale die-offs, disappearances of white-lipped peccaries. We had one in the Rupununi from a 10-year period from around 2010 to 2022 or so. But it seems to be part of their natural life cycle that they have this population cycling, where they have their populations go way up very high, and then they crash and go down, and then they come up again over time. But the population that we observed in the Barima-Mora Passage seemed to be very abundant, and we documented them on a number of cameras, and it seemed to be quite large herds. Game species that was a little bit less common is the collared peccary. So the smaller peccary species. This species forms smaller herds, only up to about 40 individuals, but they're also a commonly hunted and eaten species in the Barima-Mora Passage area. They're not as tolerant of flooded areas as white-lipped peccaries. They also are direct competitors with white-lipped peccaries. So in areas where you have large white-lipped peccary herds, collared peccaries are outcompeted or even beaten up by the larger white-lipped peccaries, and so you tend to see less of them, and they tend to inhabit the sort of more upland areas. So we documented collared peccaries on a few cameras, but not nearly as many as the white-lipped. And then, of course, everybody's favorite food animal in the Barima-Mora Passage, as well as the Rupununi and many other places, the laba or lowland paca. These guys, and there's a better picture of what the laba actually looks like in full color. But these guys were fairly common in the Barima-Mora Passage. They are almost always associated with water. They burrow along water edges. They're capable swimmers and divers. They can stay underwater for a long period of time if they're fleeing predators. And so we weren't surprised to see them in the Barima-Mora Passage, and we're happy to see that they showed up on many cameras at many different locations, and so their population seemed to be fairly stable in the area. The laba's cousin here, who works the day shift. So laba are fully nocturnal, right? Red-rumped agoutis are fully diurnal, so they're moving around during the day. This was the most common species caught on camera traps in the Barima-Mora Passage, which is not uncommon, right? We've seen the same in our research all over the Rupununi and Aukrama and Kanaku Mountains, right? These guys are the most common species that you might see in a camera trap survey in Guyana. And that's good news, because these guys are an important seed disperser. They're one of the only species that's capable of predating and dispersing the seeds of the largest trees that are most important for timber and maintaining sort of forest structure. So these guys are feeding on some seeds, and then they're caching other seeds. So they're burying seeds all around the place, and they bury so many seeds that they forget where some of the seeds are that they buried. And then those seeds that they forget about are actually planted and grow up into the sort of next generation of trees. So even though it's a very common species, it's a critical species for forest health and maintaining forest structure. So it's a good sign that they're so common in the Barima-Mora Passage as well. Our next species was a complete surprise to me. I was not expecting to see giant anteaters moving around in mangrove swamps. I'll be totally honest. These guys are, not only do they look strange, they also behave a little bit strangely as well, right? So the giant anteaters continue to be a mystery to me. We've seen them in the Rupununi all over every stitch of forest, savanna, mountains, and everywhere in between. I was not expecting to see them tromping around in the mud in mangrove forest, but here they are. Right, we saw giant anteaters on multiple cameras. I can't remember exactly how many offhand, but it was great to see them roaming around in Barima-Mora Passage. The thing that makes them so dynamic and flexible in terms of the number of habitats that they can inhabit is that their food is everywhere, right? When you eat ants and termites, you can find food anywhere you go. You go right in GT and go in somebody's house and find termites, right? So giant anteaters can find food wherever. And so if they can navigate the mangrove forest, then they can persist there. They're also a near threatened species by the IUCN Red List. And so a species to keep an eye on, and a good species to get information on, again, at the edge of their range. The southern tamandua is the giant anteater's smaller cousin, much more arboreal. So giant anteaters do climb trees, not very tall trees, but southern tamanduas spend more time up in the canopy than they do on the ground. But here we were able to document a couple of them walking around and foraging on the ground in between, and fairly dynamic, flexible, and common species around Guyana. As I said earlier, the common opossum or yauri was one of the most common species documented on camera traps. They're very flexible. They can live in urban environments, suburban environments, agricultural landscapes, forests, savannas, swamps, and everywhere in between. So it was no big surprise that we saw common opossums in the Barima-Mora Passage, and that they were very common on our cameras, but another species of note. The only species of primate that we documented on cameras was this guy, the wedge-capped capuchin. We did see spider monkeys as we were moving around the forest and setting our cameras. And we heard from a few others that there are at least squirrel monkeys, if not some other species, also present in the Barima-Mora Passage. So I would guess probably 3 to 4 primate species in the area, but this is an area of research that could stand some more work to sort of understand the primate community. Obviously, camera traps catch things really well that are walking around on the ground. Most primates don't do that very often, but capuchin monkeys forage on the ground regularly. And so they're the species that we see most common on camera traps sort of all over Guyana. So it was good to see a few of them pop up on our cameras in Barima-Mora. So a few of the ground birds that were notable that we observed on camera traps. I won't go too far into the bird species that we document because Dr. O'Shea is going to be talking to you about the bird community and their surveys a little bit later here today. But the notable ground bird species, which are also important game species very often, we had the great tinamou, also known as the mom, bush chicken, right, of sort of a large game bird species that can fly but walks around primarily on the ground. And they're a common sight on our camera traps, also used frequently as a game species. The most common bird that we documented across all of the camera trap studies is the black curassow or pauis, another game species, very common, seen all over the camera traps in Barima-Mora Passage, in swampy habitats, in upland forests, and everywhere in between. Pauis were listed by the IUCN Red List until recently when they were delisted, but they're always a species of conservation concern. They're fairly common across the forests of Guyana, but are threatened by hunting elsewhere across the range in the Amazon. So a good species to know that's present in the Barima-Mora Passage and fairly common. The last of the ground birds that we observed are these guys, the marbled wood quail, which are a fairly rare sighting on camera traps. Again, we've gotten a handful of photos of them across all the work that we've done in the Rupununi. So I was actually kind of surprised to see them in the Barima-Mora Passage because they're not typically associated with swampy, inundated habitats. So the photos, we did get them on a couple of different cameras, and all of the photos were on the kind of upland forests behind the mangroves. They were also recently delisted by the IUCN Red List with some further habitat, but another species that in other parts of their range is affected by hunting. They're also somewhat of a habitat, their habitat that they prefer is somewhat limited. And so a good species to know is present and to keep an eye on across the BMP. And there's a better look at what they look like because the camera trap picture is not great. A couple of notable species of mammals that we observed while moving in and around the Barima-Mora Passage, going to set cameras. Of course, you wouldn't expect to get manatee photos on a camera, except for maybe these ones from the botanical gardens that almost come out of the pond. But we did observe West Indian manatees in the Barima River as we were going towards the ocean, setting cameras in sort of the most northern part of the BMP. We did see some West Indian manatees in the river. This species is considered to be vulnerable by the IUCN Red List, so it's good to know that this species is around, that it's present, and that it's using this river system. Further towards the extreme extent of the Barima-Mora Passage, going really towards the ocean, mostly in saltwater habitats, we did observe some estuarine dolphins, which are another near-threatened species. And actually a recently identified species only in the last 20 years. But these guys are common in the brackish water and along the coast, all across the coast of South America. You can actually go out sometimes. You go out to the jetty by the Marriott, you can very often see both manatees and these Guianan dolphins out there fishing. So we observe some, so it's good to know that they're part of the species list. We saw lots of birds as we were moving around setting our cameras, and I will leave those descriptions to Dr. O'Shea, but I noticed that nobody was presenting anything on herpetofauna, so we did observe a few reptiles and amphibians while we were walking around setting cameras. That includes 2 species of turtles. So the spot-legged wood turtle is a forest turtle, fairly small size like this. You often find them in puddles and little shallow flooded areas in the forest. We also saw the yellow-footed tortoise, which is a vulnerable species according to the IUCN, and a species that is often harvested for food. And actually, this individual that we saw was in the process of being harvested for food by someone else outside of our team when we saw them. We were told by guides that the red-footed tortoise is also present in the Barima-Mora Passage, which is another IUCN listed species, but that the yellow-footed tortoise is far more common. We did come across this Lobaria, right, or fertilance as we were walking around, which is another surprising thing for me. I wasn't expecting them to, they're a tropical forest species. I wasn't expecting them in the mangrove habitat, but obviously you can see by the picture, there it is. And the brown tree runner, this is also sometimes called the Jesus lizard because they're able to run across the surface of the water. So you wouldn't be surprised that these guys are in a flooded forest habitat. So hopefully this overview gave you an idea of some of the species and that we observed in the Barima-Mora Passage with our camera trap survey, and a few of our sort of key findings to highlight again. We had an extremely high number of mammal and bird species for mangrove and coastal wetland habitat. So this is my first time doing camera trap work sort of in this coastal wetland mangrove habitat. So once we had the camera trap photos, I had to kind of go to the literature and look at other similar surveys, and I found that it's pretty rare to have these tropical forest species like big cats, jaguars, deer, peccaries, right? moving from tropical forest down into the mangroves, and or moving back and forth and using a little bit of both, right? Most of the other camera trap surveys of mangrove and coastal habitat that I saw documented a fairly low number, particularly of mammals. And it was really those species that are most associated with swamps, like raccoons and pacas and those kinds of things. So documenting a full swath that's actually comparable to some of the surveys that we've done in tropical forest habitats in Guyana's interior was surprising, and also a very encouraging part of our survey of the Barima-Mora Passage, because any efforts to protect or manage this habitat would encompass a wide swath of species of conservation interest. I think the impact of hunting and the game market in Maburuma would warrant some further research. We really only got a little bit of anecdotal information from our team members about which species were hunted and how often people were hunting them, and we saw a little bit of the wild meat market there in Maburuma as we were going to board our boats to go out and do our field work every day. But a number of the species that were documented here are species that are affected by hunting elsewhere. So understanding what are the current levels of hunting on which species and what's the impact would be a good place to spend some time in the future. We also had the lowland tapir was absent from our survey. So the bush cow, it's known to be in the area. We actually saw a bush cow track as we were walking around setting the cameras. And I know research teams, Felicia, who's presenting later, was part of a research team from the PAC working in Shell Beach, and they did have tapir on their camera trap survey. So we know that they're present in the area, but maybe fairly uncommon. And research teams indicated that they are hunted and traded for home use and for commercial sale. And we do know from our other research that tapir are the species that is most affected by hunting pressure in Guyana, right? They're the largest terrestrial herbivore in Guyana. They're also very slow reproducing. And so all of those facts add up to sort of a species that's easily affected by hunting pressure. So that'll be a good thing to understand. In addition, while we were doing the camera trap surveys, the water quality surveys were happening. So we got a look at that data. I won't spoil the results because I know Felicia is presenting on that later. But the association between the presence of some of these species, especially aquatic species like giant river otters, and the water quality in the Barima-Mora Passage is something that raises a potential concern and an area for further research. And additionally, and lastly, with any coastal habitat in Guyana and the offshore activities that are going on, research into where fresh and saltwater mixing occurs in the Barima-Mora Passage, how far upstream, under what conditions, and all of that would help inform the management of this area for the future in the event of an accident offshore, right? And so understanding how mangrove habitats could be affected by these activities, I think, would be a key part of research in this area moving forward. But overall, as I said from the beginning, I was very surprised and very pleased with the medium and large mammal community in Barima-Mora Passage. It reminded me a lot more of the tropical rainforest that you would see in the interior in a place like Iwokrama. I see Raquel in the front row there, so she would recognize a bunch of these species from these camera trap photos. And so the fact that you have all of these species present in mangrove habitat is wonderful. Before I wrap up and take questions, I want to thank our team. You see everybody here: Smokey, David, Fernando, Carl, Leslie, Felicia, Shanika, and Tracy. This whole team made this work possible, right? I wasn't out there on my own setting and checking all these cameras. We did all of this as a team. And then those cameras went, Felicia carried on with those cameras to do a survey of the Shell Beach area after learning along with the team here. Everybody was great, brought a real positive attitude in some really hard field work, right? Tromping around in the mud all day long. Was hot, was sweaty, it was hard work. And this team was great, really knowledgeable of the area, and brought a great attitude and lots of effort to the work, and was really pleasurable. So thank you very much for having me today and letting me present and share our findings.